Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Suzanne Wunz. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. And on behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's talk about the enduring legacy of Rodriguez, creating new pathways to equal educational opportunity. And there are copies of the book available from the coop just outside of the room. So as you leave, you'll see them and you can pick up your own copy there. I'd like to thank the Dean's Office for the refreshments today, and I also wanted to let everyone know that today's talk is being taped, so when we get to the questions portion, please know that any questions you ask will be part of that recording. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, the two editors of the book, Professor Charles Ogletree, the Jesse Climenko Professor of Law, and the founding and executive director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, and Professor Kimberly Robinson, professor at the University of Richmond School of Law and researcher at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. And with that, I will hand it over.
And a graduate of Harvard Law School.
That's worth noting, too. And with that, I will hand it over to our two editors.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here this wonderful day. I hope you're enjoying the opportunity to hear us talk about that, and nothing's more important than education. I'm going to read a quote that Justice Brennan wrote in a case very familiar to most of you about education, how important it is. And we wrote this book with the idea that folks would understand it and appreciate it and realize that if you want to do something, get a job, work, you have to get an education and how important that is. And we're going to talk about that, and some of it's covered in the book as well. And we have some of the authors of chapters of the book also that Kimberly will introduce going forward. What Justice Warren said back in 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education, he said, "It is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he or she is denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity where the state has undertaken to provide it is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms." And that's exactly what we're talking about in this book, and I think you'll have a chance to see that. I want to introduce Kimberly Robinson, who will tell a little bit about the book and say a little bit about what we're going to do, and then the rest of the time is to take questions from you. We ask that you just raise your hand. There are microphones right here. We ask that your question be focused on education, on the book, things like that. We know that when you were born, how great you are, all those things. You don't have to put all that in, but the focus will be very important. So I'm very happy to collaborate on this book with Professor Kimberly Robinson, and I'll turn it over to her. Kimberly?
All right, thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited to be here, to be back at my alma mater. So we decided to commission this book in conjunction with a conference that we did at the University of Richmond School of Law to look at the impact of the decision in San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the case, essentially what the Supreme Court held in that case was a case brought by Mexican-American school children and their parents in Texas. They were from districts with relatively low property wealth value, and they sued the state of Texas and said that the Constitution should provide them a right to education, and that the disparities that they were experiencing between districts within Texas were a violation of that Constitution. And so this case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court disagreed with their claims and rejected them and held that there is not a fundamental right to education, and they gave several reasons for that. They also noted that wealth is not a suspect class in the Rodriguez decision. So what they explained in the decision is that one of the key reasons why they did not want to find education to be a fundamental right is the importance of local control in education. States and localities have the primary authority over education, and they felt that it was not the province of the federal courts to recognize such a right. They said there's no either explicit right in the Constitution, and they also noted we do not find an implicit right in the Constitution, even though prior cases had found implicit rights, even though there was no specific text that supported such a right. And so the court said, we will not find such a right. And at the time, there was substantial disagreement about how best to structure school finance systems. And so they said, we don't want to jump into the province of experts, educators, legislators who are trying to decide these issues and come up with solutions to terribly difficult problems. But the court did give sort of kind of a ray of hope in the sense that it said, well, although we don't find a right, we do recognize the need for greater equality in education systems. However, we believe and trust that the states and localities will work toward that equality, and we see even advances within Texas that we're moving toward greater equality within the system. And so we're going to leave this within the province of state and local governments. So that decision was in 1973. And as many of you are aware, if you've been living in the United States of America for any length of time, we continue to have substantial disparities in educational opportunity throughout the United States. There have been many rounds of litigation, state court litigation. So Rodriguez, one of the important legacies is that it closed the federal courthouse door to school finance litigation. You cannot sue in federal court to allege that the Constitution is violated because a neighboring district even gets twice as much as your district does for school funding. That is not a constitutional claim. And so what happened is this drove litigation into the state courts. And many states have taken up the mantle of recognizing that the rights enshrined in state constitutions do provide a right to either an equitable education or some kind of adequate education, depending on the state that you're in. Other states, however, have found that this was essentially left to the legislatures and the discretion of legislatures within the Constitution, and thus it was not the province of the courts to decide these issues. And so there's been some progress within state courts, some substantial victories. Today we have Michael Rebell here with us at the front table. He wrote one of the chapters in the book, and he was one of the initiators of the New York litigation. So you can wave, Michael, so they know who you are. So we were proud to have him write a chapter about not only what happened in New York, but also is there a possibility that the court could eventually overturn the decision. So there has been some successful state court litigation. Initially, one of the early cases, Serrano, you may have heard of out in California, was one of the early cases that said, no, a child's education should not be dependent on the wealth of the property value within the district. However, what we've seen more than 40 years after the Rodriguez decision is that these disparities in educational opportunity that are created by school finance systems have remained longstanding and entrenched and extremely resistant to change. So even where state legislatures have pushed to change them, you might see some increases in funding when there's a successful suit. What you don't see is a complete overhaul in most places of the funding system, with some minor exceptions, such as in New Jersey, where there's been very successful litigation. In most places, you still have the quality of a child's education driven by the value of property within the district in which they live. And so the problem with that, as might seem self-evident, is that you end up having many children left in schools without adequate funding to provide a high-quality education, and you have other children who are provided an excellent education, and there's no ability or right to challenge that disparity in federal court, and the state courts have not been particularly effective. Even those within our book who have had victories in state court litigation note that more needs to be done beyond state court litigation to make progress as a nation. And so Charles and I commissioned these chapters and decided to do this book really to be forward-looking. So given that we've had this long-standing problem, what should we do? What should the nation do? How can we think creatively about this issue? How as a nation can we move forward? So 2/3 of the books, part 2 and 3, really have innovative proposals of, okay, if we actually wanted to make progress on this issue, what should we do? And so I'm just going to mention 3 of those chapters briefly in a few sentences, and then we wanted to spend most of the time on questions and answers rather than just have us up here talking. So I'm going to just describe 3 of the chapters briefly. So first, there's a chapter by David Ciara and Daniel Fari. That's chapter 6 in the book. And they talk about the New Jersey litigation. You remember I mentioned that as some of the most successful litigation in the country. And so what happened in New Jersey is that the victories in the series of cases called Abbott has led the court to recognize that the state must link its funding system to what is needed to ensure that children are provided what they need to learn what the content of state standards. Now, for those of you who don't spend a lot of time in education, you probably don't know that most states have standards now. Standards was a movement that came around in the 80s. We eventually began to develop standards for what states began to develop standards for what children should know and be able to do for each grade and then upon graduation. So this came in substantial part from the Charlottesville Summit in 1989, was further supported by federal legislation, but ultimately all states now, and also No Child Left Behind, again, supported and reinforced the need for standards. What's remarkable about the New Jersey thing and what's lamentable about it is two things. So it's remarkable in that this is really the first state to require a state funding system to be linked and focused after successful litigation on the content and resources that students need to be provided to learn the content of state standards. What's lamentable about it is that this is even noteworthy or exceptional. We have had state standards for a very long time now, and still, state funding systems actually are not often created to ensure that children learn the content of those standards. Actually, one of the great things that School of Finance litigation has revealed is that the formula is often derived basically upon political bargain. You have an amount available for education, you have people who are there to represent their district, and they bargain over who should get what, who should get how much, what can I horse trade over? And that is often how education is funded. The decisions are made based on the politics of state legislatures and not upon the needs of children. So that has been something which has come out in numerous state funding cases, the irrationality. Most recently in Texas, the court said, this system isn't even designed to provide children what they need to learn the state standards, despite the fact that you keep testing them to learn what's in the standards. The funding system is not linked to that. So that is one of the key problems, and what David Sierra and Daniel Fari propose is that the federal government shall ultimately incentivize states to link their funding systems to what students need to learn in state standards. So that's just one of the proposals. In addition, another chapter, this is by Derek Black, he proposes numerous reforms to Title I. And the brief story on Title I is that it's a program by the federal government to provide funding to low-income children. He notes that there are numerous problems with this statute, including the fact that oftentimes funding is distributed in ways that does not focus on concentrated poverty, and it also is given based on the size of the district, even though that might not relate to concentrated poverty or the need of the students in the district. So he proposes a number of reforms to Title I that would help to focus on greater equity in education and greater integration in schools. And then finally, I'll just talk about my own chapter in the book. So I take a look at the issue of education federalism. So in my chapter, I talk about the fact that part of the problem today with education reform is that we are tinkering at the margins. We are trying to create a great charter school here, and we are trying to give choice here, and we are trying to test the evaluation of teachers based on how their students do. But we are not looking at the very foundation of why our system is broken. And I argue in my chapter, I would say persuasively, that education federalism is one of the reasons why we have a broken education system. So education federalism basically is the idea that states and localities should have primary and almost exclusive control over education, and the federal government should have a very limited role. Now that has shifted over time, but that still remains a pretty bedrock principle of the governance of education, even with the increase of No Child Left Behind and the federal role that brought. It still required states to set the standards for students and states to define what a highly qualified teacher was, except for some basic federal requirements. And so what I argue is that we need to rethink how the education governance is decided, and that we need to draw upon numerous strengths of the federal government, including priority making equal access to an excellent education a priority, focusing on common opportunity to learn standards, focusing on things that the federal government does well and still leave to the states what they do well. So the idea is this would increase the federal role in education, but also in ways that demand that all children get equal access to an excellent education. No longer would it be possible to just opt out. We don't want to give equal access. We're focused on other priorities. Every parent, everyone wants this for their child, and we all benefit from it as a nation when it's provided, yet we don't do it. So my chapter argues that there is a fundamental problem in the structure of how we govern education, and that if we take a look at that foundation, we could address some of the other challenges. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions and answers to discuss what you want to hear about and what interests you about this topic. So, and there's the mic. Sorry if that was too long.
My name's Raj. I'm from Texas. I was a former teacher, so very excited that you guys focused on my state. Quick question is, so I think we could imagine two scenarios. One is where we just sort of take money away from the schools that have more, and then we would just say, you know, every school gets X amount of dollars. But then we could imagine like wealthy parents simply spending more on their kids outside of school, and these disparities would continue. Or we could imagine a scenario where we were to provide lower income schools with sort of greater funding. So is it an issue of adequacy, that is to say providing every school with like $8,000 per kid, or is it an issue of disparity, that is to say like wealthy school has 8,000, lower income school has 6,000? Because I think the policy solutions are different based on what the core problem is.
Take it.
You know, I think that's a great question. I think it's a very complex problem, and I think part of the reason that there haven't been some sort of easy fixes is because you have these sort of debates about ultimately what's the goal. So there's a variety of ways to create a more equitable system of school funding. Mostly what you want to focus on, I believe, is a couple things. One, you want to address student need. Where there are disparate needs, you should be addressing them. So of course we all recognize for example, special education students, disabled students, often need additional resources. In your state, English language learners, large population that need additional resources. You have low-income students who often need wraparound services. That's counseling support for not only themselves, but for their families, support for any number of social problems that are happening at home, possibly, that has led to sort of where they are. And so addressing the needs of students, sort of a need-based focus, is important in addressing funding disparities, as well as sort of encouraging high achievement among children. So the idea being address where there's any kind of sort of educational challenge, but also make sure that all children have access to an excellent education. I don't think that we're ever going to get to a perfectly equal education system, and I'm not sure that that's really the right goal. But I think right now what we're failing to do is address the needs, the disparate needs of children, and we do it largely based on wealth. There's also some correlation with race in many states, and that's simply an irrational way to fund education. And then we pay for it on the back end through, Secretary Duncan recently just called for states and localities to reallocate money that they spend on prisons into the schools. Why? Because if you look at the prison population, so often the reading levels within the population are low, and that is one of the reasons why criminal activity becomes an option, because, you know, coming to Harvard Law School was not an option, right? If you don't learn to read by a certain point, it becomes very hard to do so later. So those are some of the challenges.
I would also say that it's worth taking a look at the work that Mayor Rahm Emanuel has done in Chicago. And he's had the same problem, you know, what do we do with failing schools, what do we do with succeeding schools? And I'm not sure he had the right solution, but it was a solution. The idea was, let me put some schools together, close some schools. And that was based on his view as a mayor, what needed to be done, what made the most sense in Chicago. But if you think about it and think about what's happened around the country, we are still have a lot of work to do. My wife, who's here, and friends of mine, Kathy Reddick, others, Caroline Hunter, we started a charter school. A charter school is a public school. And the idea was that black children weren't getting an adequate education in the public schools that they were attending. And we had a rush of people coming to the charter school, which is a public school. And now it's the Banneker School now is a rewarded school. People have gone from kindergarten up to 8th grade, and then they're going on to high school and then college. It's been working in a very significant way, and that we're very happy with. So I'm hoping that that people will take the same initiative that we took. That our whole idea would be that we have to educate children. It's the only thing. We heard it in 1954 in the school case. The whole idea that children are important and that we have to, in a sense, get involved early on. And if we don't, we'll miss the boat. And I think that we're on the right track going forward. Next question. Hands up.
Thanks for coming. Do you think that if the Supreme Court had established a right to education, that the landscape would be different? And I ask that coming from South Africa, where we do have the right to education in the Constitution, but still have massive problems with equity as well as quality.
That's a good question, and I'll answer it first and turn it over to Kimberly. It's interesting to think about the South African Constitution. Read it. People need to read it. It's one of the most generous and over-embracing constitutions that we can imagine. I went there and talked about the right to a constitution many decades ago, and Nelson Mandela was alive then, was talking about how important it was to get an education. I was amazed to see that South Africa had all these rights and we had nothing to do with it. The whole idea is that, we're a new nation. We want to come out and give everybody the opportunity to be educated. And I think that becomes a major problem when you're trying to implement it and try to make sure things are going to happen. And I think we've seen the problem in Chicago, how much it meant bringing schools together and putting people together. It just doesn't work. And I think that the book is designed to make people think hard about education, how it is a fundamental right. It should be a part of what every child receives, and every child should be treated the same, with the idea that they should have an opportunity to go on to elementary school, middle school, high school, college, and then a graduate school if possible. All those things are important, and I think that what we're hoping to do is to make people think about those things. Kimberly?
So I think that's also a great question. I think that it would depend, right? It depends on the nature of the right, but also it depends on the court that enforces it. So if you look at Brown and the language that Professor Ogletree began with, that a right to education should be provided on equal terms, if the court had continued to demand that, we would have a very different educational landscape. Unfortunately, because of changes in the justices over time, what happened with that right is that they eventually first were quiet for a while as the country began to, try to resist. We had massive resistance. We had the pushback against Brown. The court eventually stepped in, and after Congress acted and said, no, we're going to move forward with integrated schools. But that only lasted for a very short time. It then, when ultimately it was looked to say, can we cross district lines to integrate school? Because by the time of, in the early 70s, there had been so much white flight from cities that you had to cross district lines to integrate. The court had shifted to much more of an anti-integration position that said in Milliken versus Bradley that no, we will not cross district lines to do that. And that just left many urban cities without any possible ability to integrate. So easily, and then you see a series of Supreme Court decisions after that continue to erode the right to attend an integrated school, to desegregate schools. So it's very possible that if you had such a right, that the court could eviscerate it. Right? They could certainly create a hollow right that set such a low floor that nothing would change. But you also have to remember that even though we did not fully integrate the schools, we made a large amount of progress from where we were in 1954. I think it's very easy. I myself have written about how Schools are often resegregating now. But we did as a country move forward. And I think it's very possible for that to happen if the court had recognized a right. And also, I think it also could be a way for Congress to step in and help to define and enforce that right through a sort of collaborative enforcement model, which I talk about in my chapter, that there could be an approach to recognizing such a right, not that says overnight we're going to overhaul the education system, but that says let's build toward a system that does ensure equal access to an excellent education. What does that look like? Because honestly, as a nation, we've never asked that. We accept the opportunity gap, and we perpetuate it each year. So, yes, Michael. Oh, I think you got to get the mic.
Thank you. As Kimberly mentioned, I wrote a chapter in this book that really was an outline for Rethinking Rodriguez, bringing a new litigation soon to try to get the court to rethink it. And your question raised in my mind a very interesting point, which is, I won't go into the details of my theory about what the court might reconsider. It has to do with the fact that the adequacy issue, the question of whether kids in Texas at the time were getting a minimum education which would prepare them to be voters. That was the essence of Marshall's dissent, that if there was no explicit or implicit right to education, there was the 15th Amendment. Kids were going to grow up to be voters. There was the First Amendment. They'd grow up to be people who had a right to self-expression and needed a decent education to be able to carry out those functions. And Powell and the majority said, well, we agree kids need an education to be voters, et cetera, but nobody argued here that they're not getting that minimum. They just argued we're not getting as much money as somebody else. So that issue can be raised. And the question is it going to make any difference? On the remedy thing, I'll leave out all the legal doctrines. What's fascinating, I think, is what's happened with these state court litigations for the last 40 years. We've had litigations in 45 out of the 50 states. It's been the most active area of state constitutional development in the country's history. It's really been what Justice Brandeis said back in 1926, a laboratory of the states. So one of the issues that bothered the majority in Rodriguez in 1973, as Kimberly outlined, was that this was a complex area of educational policy. Courts would not know what to do. How do we delve into this morass? We're staying out of it, leave it to the legislatures. But what's happened with this laboratory of the states over the last 40 years is we've had an incredible variety of doctrinal approaches and remedial approaches. Some have been very successful, like New Jersey. Some have not been so successful. But we've got a game plan here, and we've got an experiential racetrack. So if one were to go back to the Supreme Court now, you could answer that question. What would it mean if there were a federal right? How would we enforce it? And it's just a fascinating area to think about the intricate federal-state involvements here and the relationship between federal courts and state courts. Sorry if I took too long, but that just hit me as something worth saying.
I think one of the other things that Michael quotes is a quote from the 1954 decision, which puts education at the top. And it says here, the Supreme Court wrote, "Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he or she is denied the opportunity for an education." It says he, it should be he or she, but that's the 1954 court, which is male-oriented and focused on men and boys, not on boys and girls like it should be. But I think that tells us how important it is, and it tells us exactly what South Africa was striving for, pushing for, with the idea of including all these rights in the Constitution. I think they went a little far. It's up to people to decide, but I think that gave us a good sense about what education is and how it ties in and all the other jobs, employment, opportunity, education, makes all the difference in the world. Question?
I know you talked a lot about New Jersey and about the Abbott case, but I don't know if you have been following or read Dale Russakoff's book about the Newark School District and how, so obviously like money isn't enough because it can be spent not allocated wisely. So what else besides resources do we need, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's definitely not a question of just pouring more money into the schools, because you can certainly pour good money after bad. You know, you can certainly just pour a lot of money into a place that is not going to use the money wisely. I think part of what is needed, in addition to looking at funding disparities, so there are places that don't get these large grants and gifts from individuals who do still struggle with getting some of just the basics for education. But I think in addition, there needs to be accountability mechanisms for how that money is directed. Where are the needs for children? Part of what you face in a lot of inner city schools is what I alluded to briefly earlier, is the need for schools to help to serve as a place for wraparound services. So that is basically the idea that schools can serve as an entry point for ensuring that students get all the supports that they need for education. Because if a child comes to school hungry, they're not going to focus. If a child goes home to violence in the home, who cares about long division, right? So it's helping to address the larger social barriers that are placed upon children that impede their learning. And so I think that's partly what SMART service is designed to address, those things. Schools can be a real entry point for that. And partly, unfortunately, in the United States, we depend on schools to be really one of the places to address disparities in society. So really schools are meant to be this engine, right? Catalyst for the American dream. You're supposed to come out of school on the other side and everyone has this equal chance. Well, if we're gonna do that, we need to address within schools the ability and help all students to succeed in those schools. So I think you're absolutely right that it's not about getting to some really high funding figure, it's about how is the money spent. The other thing I think is really important is that so often smart people don't go into teaching, right? So if you look around a room, for example, of doctors or lawyers, you often see their kids become doctors and lawyers. You look around a room of teachers and you ask them how many of them are going to encourage their kids to go into teaching. Very few, right? They want their kids to go into another profession because it's not esteemed in the way that it should be, given that it's such an important mechanism for what our goals are within society. So I think that's part of what the challenge is ensuring that teachers are provided both the support and salary that they need and to be able to draw bright people. So those are some of the things that are needed.
Yeah, I had a similar question in that beyond the financial inequity, in what ways might there be potential to address just the difference of peer environments and that in schools in which many students are struggling to meet the basic requirements for a grade level? I know that poses a significant challenge to then educating even those who are not presently falling behind. So I guess in addition to funding means, how might those performance inequities be addressed?
I'll say something briefly about a program that was implemented here many years ago with the idea that if all the children get an education, they'll be fine. And there's a program called the METCO program, M-E-T-C-O program, and the idea was to take the children from the poorest communities in Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and to put them in the suburbs to the schools, and that they would, in a sense, get the education that everybody's entitled to and everybody should receive. And that was a very worthwhile program. The idea was worthwhile and an important one, but it had its shortcomings because the students who were at those suburban schools were saying, wait a minute, who are these kids? Why are they taking up our time? Why are they in our classrooms? Why do we have to feed them? Why do we have to bus them? And it became an issue, and that's what METCO was a good design for Massachusetts to go forward on, but it was a failure, I think, in the sense that the people in the suburbs weren't prepared for the idea that folks are going to change. A lot has changed since Medco was started. A lot has changed in terms of educational parity. What makes the difference, quite frankly, is that getting children educated at very young ages, and you say, wait, well, you mean after fifth grade? No, not after kindergarten. No, it's before that. When they come out of the womb, you need to talk about education, talk about it, and that makes an enormous amount of difference. That's something that has to be transferred to people of color and poor people as well to understand how important it is. My parents, my mother and father, never finished high school, but that was okay. My grandfather and grandmother didn't even go to high school. That was okay because they came from an environment from the South, from Arkansas and Alabama. They didn't know anything other than that, but they saw how important it was for their children to get an education. And I think that's what we have to do, instill in folks when they're very young, how important it is to get an education and stick with it. And then that makes all the other things happen, high school, college, graduate school, anything that you want to pursue.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that school reform, effective school reform, should emphasize actually in terms of peers is the importance of having middle-class schools. So the research is actually very robust that having a predominantly middle-class school helps to improve the achievement of all students. So if you look at, now there's dispute about exactly where the cutoff is. Is it 40% low income and the rest middle class is at 50%? But if you don't exceed a certain threshold, the middle class students still do very well, but the achievement of low income students is raised. There is a tipping point though, however, when that does not hold true, and you will have upper class students in a predominantly poor school who actually do worse than they would do in a predominantly middle class school. So I think the distribution of middle class families is essential in terms of creating effective schools, in part because it's not sitting next to a middle class kid, right? It's what all those middle class families bring to the school: accountability, a focus on making sure that teachers are effective, helping to understand the access to college, applying to college, many of you aren't too far from that, is a complex business these days. Understanding, being part of access to networks, middle-class networks, activities, scholarships, all of those things are things that children get access to in middle-class schools, so that's particularly important. Wait for the mic or else it won't come up. And then in the back, she's been waiting, I think, a while. Over back there.
So building off of that idea of creating more middle-class schools or making sure more of our students are in middle-class schools, I know Richard Kahlenberg talks a lot about socioeconomic integration in schools. So rather than doing racial integration, we should be focusing on bringing more of our high-income and low-income students together. What do you think the best or most effective mechanisms are for creating those middle-class schools and making sure that our students have access to them? I don't know that I think socioeconomic integration is realistic, but maybe it is.
So the mechanisms that have seen the greatest success for that are called controlled choice. So controlled choice basically allows for parents to have identify their first top 3 choices of schools, but then the district looks at the background of schools to help to create racially integrated schools, socioeconomically integrated schools. That has largely been the most effective means. Another means of creating middle-class schools are magnet schools. However, you have to make sure that the testing requirements are not so high to get into a magnet school that you don't essentially create an only upper and middle class school. So those are 2 of the actual mechanisms to get to a middle class school. There are others, but those are the 2 most popular and that have proven to be most effective. She's had a question for a while.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Brad, and I work at the Child Advocacy Program here at Harvard. And I wanted to return to this idea of returning to Rodriguez and if there's any more work that can be done with that case. So if I remember, correctly, there's dicta in the case that says that an absolute deprivation of education could be a violation of a fundamental right. And I'm wondering if there's any work being done around that concept, trying to find cases where that might be applicable, such as, for example, immediately after Katrina in New Orleans, when there weren't any schools. You know, is there any work around that being done to try to relitigate that case?
So definitely, certainly there have been conversations about whether there should be, another Rodriguez case brought. I don't get the sense that there's a lot of momentum for that right now, in part because reading the tea leaves of the court, how do we think that the case will come out? But I think that's certainly possible, and certainly, one of the things I wanted to make sure to say while I'm here at Harvard is, one of the best things that you all can do to help address this issue is become part of the team of people working on it. There's lots of lawyers who, including myself, including Michael, who dedicate our careers to addressing the disparities in educational opportunity. That is our life's work, and there are many avenues for doing this. So if you look, for example, many of you probably have heard of the recent case out of California, where the court recently held that some of the teacher tenure laws and the last in, first out laws that adversely affected low-income and low-performing schools violated the California Constitution. A lawyer made that up, right? That didn't exist before the lawyer brought that to court. So what I always tell my students is lawyers, and there's whole books written about lawyers and school reform. Lawyers are driving a lot of school reform. And if a future Rodriguez case is going to be brought, it may be brought by some of the people in this very room. It's partly having the momentum and having a well-designed, not just litigation plan, but also being part of a social movement. And we're getting some of that social movement happening. Part of Wendy Kopp's design, if any of you have read any of her writings, part of her design for Teach America wasn't just about getting some teachers in the classroom for a couple years. That is a small part of her plan. The big part of her plan is to educate generations of people who understand that the education system is broken and unequal and should do something about it. So what happens now? You have generations of those people who were in the classroom for 2 years. They are now state chiefs. They are now running nonprofits in education. They are now lawyers who are at the Department of Education. So there's many avenues to sort of work on this issue, and I definitely get a sense that there's building momentum, that the system is broken and we need to do something about it, and there's increasing pressure on the system to change. It just requires the leadership to move forward on the issue. So part of why we wrote this book was to provide some, part of what Wendy says in her blurb on the book is really, this is part of thinking deeper about what needs to happen in education reform. It's not just about the Common Core standards. It's not just about that. It's about addressing the very foundations of our nation's education system. And I would argue that some of you in this room could be a big part of that. So I just wanted to get that in before some of you had to go to class.
I agree with that too. There's a question up here, right? While you get the microphone, I'm thinking about it, this room is just like the people who started the whole idea of education, how important it was. Thurgood Marshall, a poor kid, lived in a segregated community in Baltimore, Maryland, and then he was trained by Charles Hampton Houston, also coming from Washington, D.C., but coming here and using his education to make a big difference. I think that people here can make a big difference as well, and I think that you have to get started early, and that's what they did. And the whole idea is that Charles Hampton Houston took Thurgood Marshall out as a young man to see segregation, how important it was, and how denying the opportunities that it created. And that made Thurgood a great lawyer, made him a great justice, and made him very thoughtful on these issues of education. And that he died saying that how important it is. And I think now we see any photographs of him, pictures of him, with a sense of how much he did. But he always gives credit to Charles Hampton Houston. So somebody may be talking in your ear about what you're going to do next, and I think you have to listen very carefully, because those are the people who understand what it means to be successful, what it means to be appropriate, what it means to be leaders in the 21st century. Question?
Actually, not a question, but I want to have a comment to follow up on this conversation. I'm Michael Gregory. I'm on the faculty here, and as many of you know, I teach education law and policy and teach the education law clinic. So I want to second the invitation that you've just received to spend your legal careers getting involved in this issue. But I want to add an addendum to what was said, and also make sure you don't leave the room thinking that there isn't a tremendous obligation on you as lawyers to work in interdisciplinary ways if you hope to fix the education system. You have to listen to communities. You have to listen to parents. You have to listen to students. You have to listen to educators about what the needs are to fix the system. And yes, working in interdisciplinary ways, there are absolutely tools that you will have at your disposal as lawyers that other professionals don't, that can really make a contribution to these issues, but you can't do it in isolation. And if you want to learn how to do that, you can come and take our clinic or come and take my class. And there's also Professor Brown-Nagin and the Child Advocacy Program that Cheryl mentioned. There's lots of opportunities here at the law school now to learn more and to really develop some skills to be able to make some movement forward on these issues. So.
That's exactly right. And I know there are going to be more questions as well. What's amazing about what Michael had to say is that you build on those successes, how important it is. And you'll find a lot of places, a lot of programs offered here and other institutions as well, where you can, in a sense, as a student, get involved with families. And you'll find in the households, the person you're trying to reach is somebody getting ready to go to high school, but the parents never went to high school, never went to college, and they have a resistance to that. And so I would get as much information as you can and play these issues in the way that you should to make sure that you're involved at a very early age and involved knocking on doors, involved representing children, because the children are our future. Questions? No questions? I guess we'll finish. Kim, you want to think closing remarks?
Well, really the closing remark I wanted to make was just to issue that challenge to you all, is to think about how you can make a difference in these issues. I think there are so many ways that lawyers, you don't have to be a litigator. As you know, I was actually a litigator for many years on, well, not many, I'm not that old, but I was for a number of years on these issues. But then I wanted to start thinking and writing about how we can start to tackle these social problems and to step back a bit from the tyranny of the urgent and responding to motions, taking depositions, to think about how we could tackle these issues from a deeper level, not just party to party, but how did we even get to this sort of place? And I think it's very possible for us to make forward movement on these issues. When you look at the history of our country, if you look at Brown versus Board of Education, 100 years before that, they would have said, you're joking. It's never going to happen. But you had a group of lawyers come together to make it happen. And I think it's also possible for that to happen within education. And we hope that through this book, part of what it will provide is some roadmaps for moving this issue forward and thinking about it deeply in new and creative ways. So that's what I would challenge you to do as you read the book. Just think about what's possible. People before Brown would have said impossible. And yet, you know, I write on these issues, I work on these issues because I do believe that true reform that overhauls the system, that links the child education system to their zip code, to their race and class, that it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we can truly move forward. And we have a national self-interest in moving forward. It's actually in our best interest to change that, particularly as our nation becomes more and more diverse and we are competing against other nations with even stronger education systems. We will either change or we will face the consequences of not changing. So,
let me just say in conclusion as well that I hope that you'll get copies of the book, not just for yourself, but for other members of your family, that they need to read it and understand what happens. And I'm thinking about two people who had a deep influence. Both of them are deceased now. Harry Elam went to school as a child here in Boston in the period of segregation, and yet he insisted on getting an education. Dorothy West, she was with the Harlem Renaissance Group way back when. and she got an education, an all-girls school, black girls school, and those schools have evolved, and they're making things happen in the 21st century. So the next Harry Elam, the next Dorothy West is right here in this room. And I think that you too can do what they did, open up the doors, make things work, make things happen, and make things in the 21st century talk about education as the most important thing that we heard the Supreme Court say many years ago, an important thing that anybody could do, and think about education and how important it is. That's our end, and we'll be happy to, you want to conclude?
Thank you very much, Professor Ogletree.